can, do so if you want. I welcome you all here now today. I just want to say I truly love you all. I'm glad you could come. I wanted to talk to you today about deep diving Nisargadatta. By the way, Jay, do you have the experience of nothingness?
I do have it, yes. Yes.
Okay.
I have to get it, but I do have it. I mean,
how hard is it for you to get it?
It's in another drawer, another room. I can just.
You want to get it?
Yeah, sure.
As you well know, my spirituality has extended back to practices of Hatha Yoga, and especially Zen for many years. And then there was a Shakti opening 11 years ago. And that Shakti opening changed everything. It brought love into my life in a way that has been permanent. And the love was so great that it entirely permeated the emptiness that Zen and Robert had revealed. But with Robert, I also had the realization 2 or 3 weeks after he left for Sedona from Los Angeles that there was something beyond consciousness even. And with that Shakti awakening in 2010 or 11, I became aware that I was one with God. I became God realized. And after that, I've lived in the divine. But I'm also aware, and increasingly so, that what I am goes beyond even the divine. No longer Brahman, a measure of all things, but para-Brahman, that which is at the root of all existence. Can you read the beginning of the first chapter of I guess it's page 1?
Yeah, Maharaj sets out the basics of the teaching.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
And it stops with the end of the first paragraph on page 2.
Okay, sure. Maharaj sets out the basics of the teaching. The nature of the consciousness has to be understood. This consciousness can arise only in the physical body, and the physical body is the essence of the five elements. It is because of the association with the physical body that there is suffering. Most people who come here will not be able to accept this type of knowledge because it is on a strictly fundamental level. But some persons who apply themselves and can accept such a point of view will really understand. They will be totally free from the impact of pain and unhappiness if they understand that the latter can only result from the consciousness which has identified itself with the physical body and suffers as an individual. In that case, suffering must inevitably result. But what is the individual? There is a body created out of the five elements, and in that body dwells the vital breath, prana, and the consciousness. It is a composite unity. All living forms contain the vital breath and the consciousness. And although the forms are different, they all contain the same elements. So I ask again, where is the question of an individual? Basically, there is none. And this is my basic teaching, which has to be grasped, but only very few will understand.
Okay, I don't know how to get back to group view.
Up on the right of the screen, view.
Yeah. There we go. I want sometimes to have Ian read also, but I wish he'd work with Jay to learn how to emphasize without emphasizing. Jay, you know what I mean. Can you work with each other so that Ian can do the reading also?
Sure, I'm going to be out of town. I'm traveling.
That's all right, don't worry.
Well, I mean, and he doesn't need it, Edgy, in my opinion. My feeling is that when he's read, it's a gift. So I wouldn't be so presumptuous. Thank you.
What Jay read was Nisargadatta's basic teachings. But these teachings are aimed at a general audience that hasn't attained for themselves, or not many of them have. So in a sense, it's just another story, another spiritual story. And what's the intent? The intent is really to say there's something about you, each of you, that's not the body, and it's not even spirit, it's not even consciousness. And that's the one who is doing the witnessing, that can witness the body, the breathing of the body, the pains of the body, the lung breathing, the gases flowing in the gut, who can watch the fluctuations of consciousness, that can go deep enough into consciousness that you can see within yourself the flowing of consciousness from the inside to the outside to become the entire manifest Brahman. At this level, you're Brahman, the totality of existence. But this understanding, although expressed in consciousness, is about consciousness from outside of consciousness, although any understanding of it is within consciousness. For what happens when you're looking at consciousness or at the body is you feel a sense of objectification of that which you see and feel. But you also see that the external world flows out of the body just as it does out of consciousness. The body, in your case, is the center of your consciousness, the center of your existence. Everything you know or have knowledge of is within existence, including your form of body. So all that you know lies within consciousness. And the first big step is to discover that you are consciousness itself and not the body. Ramana talks about it in his death experience, which was his realization experience, where he pretended to be dead and still felt his life continue. Of course, everybody could do that. But he thought it something magical. How very strange, how very great. Though the body is dead, I am not. And he said he looked within and he found the I. Which is, you might say, the action root of being a human and being vital. It's seeing the source. It's feeling the source as the looker, the feeler, the hearer, the taster, the toucher. It's a very small part of consciousness, the core. And he said, after that, he was always aware of that core. He couldn't take his eyes off of it, and it couldn't take its eyes off of him. He had found the source, which is that which is beyond consciousness, but itself is not observable. What you do observe, though, is that the source is an active root of sentience. It is the hearer, the seer, the toucher, the taster. And in that vision or comprehension or ecstatic moment, you become the hearer, the taster, the toucher, and the feeler. And at this point, there need be no words. You're dumb as a rock. The mind has no understanding because you're prior to the mind, you're prior to consciousness. And even the intrusion of consciousness muddies your understanding. You become the world at that state. One unified whole. How many have reached this point of understanding? So, read Nisargadatta. In a sense, he's even more of a guru to me than Robert. Robert was my physical guru. And Nisargadatta was my heart guru. And Janet was my being alive guru, the vital force personified. So when you read Nisargadatta, you kind of got to be clever. The words of Nisargadatta may seem perfectly clear or not, most likely not. But you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of his stories that he tells you? One by one. And basically, the first one is for you to realize that you're not just the body. The body is a shit show that you're watching from the state of consciousness. And abiding in that understanding that your consciousness itself is a state of God realization from which the Shakti can pour like an endless ocean of light and power. And after abiding in that ocean for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, you can realize that even though all of these wonderful experiences you're having of ecstasy, bliss, samadhi, oneness, of grace and love, devotion and surrender, all of these take place within consciousness. And in the end, when you're surrendering and there's nothing left of you, you clearly see that there's something still left. Which is the something behind the curtain. The great wizard, the observer of everything. and from which everything arises. Now, what we witness and we've discerned inside of ourselves as what is over 5, 10, 20, 50 years of meditation, what we call the manifest world, which includes our body, that both Robert and Nisargadatta call Brahman, the manifest Brahman. It's also called just the manifestation, the show. The phenomenal. But on the flip side, there is the part of you that is unmanifest. There's a part of you that is not phenomenal, not seeable, hearable, or knowable. It's prior to consciousness and to the body. It's unmanifest. It cannot be perceived to itself. And when you rest in the unmanifest, in the noumenal, as opposed to the phenomenal, you're resting, so to speak, in the subject, and you disappear to yourself. Resting in the noumenal, you become Brahman. And you see that, or you understand, or you're aware of, that the Brahman springs from you. But what you are is not knowable, not perceivable, not understandable. And your first awareness of this may come when you leave the dream state in the morning and go into the waking state and see that the waking consciousness comes to you. It comes to you, whatever you are. And you may look and try to find what you are that it comes to, but you cannot. The waking consciousness comes both as a gift and a curse. A gift for those who are in the divine, and a curse for those who still live in the mundane. The birth of the divine in you is an event where you recognize yourself, the poor human being, the body burdened person, lives side by side with the God within you, the manifest self, which is a composite being, as Nisargadatta said, of the life force and awareness of the life force, consciousness. But what you are is prior to both. And to give it a name would be nothingness, because there's nothing there, no thing there. At the source, there is no thing, there's no phenomena. There's no God even. The state, so to speak, if you want to call it a state, is prior to any consciousness, any knowledge, any knowing. And Nisargadatta is consistently throughout his teachings trying to walk you from the mundane to the divine to nothingness. And the essence of the divine for him is love. And so the pronouncement that sometimes I'm love, sometimes I'm nothingness. And between these two states is all of my existence as I experience it. And that's the whole thing. Once you grasp this, Nisargadatta is relatively easy to understand, and his stories make sense in a logical way based on the assumptions he makes. But the assumptions he makes seem logical from his point of view, but not your point of view as a human being, brought up and raised in phenomenality. So he's also trying to get you out of those conceptual states and habits that make you are what you are now as a human being, and take you entirely beyond them, one step at a time. First, to disidentify with the body in order to revel in consciousness and the states of consciousness, the divine, phenomenality. And in this state, relationships are still very important, because you're related to God within. You're related to all other entities without. For me, that was a woman, but also the experience of God erupting from me. In a vision lighted by 10,000 suns, as Robert would say, an infinite power rushing out of the source, out of the unmanifest, out of the noumenal, out of nothingness. And this can be yours too. But in a way, most people walk the spiritual path with so many preconceptions, because they get a part of their understanding, spiritual understanding, from Muktananda, part of it from Osho, part of it from Nisargadatta, part of it from me, part of it from Robert. So this person here, looking at his future or her future, sees not one path, but 5 or 6 or 7 paths. And it's not clear to you what you have to do at this moment. You have too many choices. Sansanim says you have to become dumb as a rock in order to find this source. Robert says you have to watch the I thought. Nisargadatta said you have to focus on I amness, and continuous focus on I amness will dissolve it, and you'll understand yourself as nothingness. He uses the term apprehend as opposed to perceive or to understand, understanding be of the mind. This is an apprehension. By the witness, the absolute, of the truth of itself in its relation to phenomenality. As the absolute, you're the source of phenomenality, the observer of the entire dance of consciousness. But you're not consciousness and you're not the body. Essentially, you're nothingness. But both Robert and Nisargadatta, I think, by making this claim, miss out on the continuance of you as God, which they have to transcend to come to the absolute. And there are some yogis who refuse to make that step from bliss and the divine life into the absolute. And they say, you can have your absolute. I worship Kali. I worship the life force. I worship love. I worship my guru or my beloved. I feel more comfortable, more grounded in the bliss of absorption in God. But then you can make the choice later of living in the states, multiple states, between love and the divine and God and nothingness. Death is I want to get the full screen. Death is around us at all times. As who was the one that wrote the books on the wizards, the shamans? Castaneda.
Oh.
As he was told by his teacher, imagine death resting on your left shoulder at all times. You, who are existent, will someday disappear. With that in mind, recognize how important every moment of life is. And recognize also that you're going to lose it. Be aware of how we fear the losing of the life of our dear ones. And the only escape from that suffering is to transcend life and identify with the Absolute, who is there before you were born and after you die, but not as an individual Absolute, but as the Absolute. And the individual rising of bubbles of consciousness happen to an apparent individual, but it's really the universal consciousness that's creating a bubble of Brahman, of the manifest, which contains your body and also contains the bliss of your surrender and devotion to God as a human. But the Absolute is entirely beyond humanhood, beyond consciousness. And this is where Mary, with her ecstatic realization of God within, at this point, cannot let go of. She's so absorbed in God realization and the divine, she can't see beyond it. She can't apprehend that she's more than human. As she repeated here in satsang many times, while she was blistering Cassie and Ian with their aloofness, she said, I'm human. I'm human. I have feelings. And because of that attachment to her humanhood, she suffered a great deal. And I'm sure she's still suffering. As do all of those who haven't fully explored the divine through God realization and the realization of oneself as consciousness, and lived in that state for a long enough period of time to understand everything about it, including that the root lies entirely before it ontologically. Conscious does not touch the Absolute. The Absolute does not touch consciousness, but it is aware of it, including your body and the divine. So in a sense, this is what the Advaita states. That you are beyond consciousness, the witness of all things. And your consciousness and your body are explorers of consciousness and of the manifest. While you, as the Absolute, gets to understand and explore all that you are as manifest beings. But you're untouched by it. It's just a picture show for you. For you, as the Absolute, it's just watching the play of consciousness. While those of you who have not reached the Absolute or apprehended it intellectually even, are the play of consciousness and have to suffer the consequences of being either a human being or the divine. Both are limited and are not the absolute. That's the Nisargadatta Robert Ramana story. There are some differences in how they explain it, but each explained it in their own ways. Robert never pointed out the totality of this aspect of Advaita teachings. Nisargadatta did it in a series of stories that are logical to themselves and can encompass the entirety of the play of consciousness. But all in all, with the final goal of releasing you even from consciousness. Robert and Ramana talked about the absolute as still being the I consciousness, which is prior to the I amness, to the manifest, which is life in this world for us, with which we identify as human beings and try with all our might to practice so that we realize ourselves as beyond the human state. I like this way of teaching, even though, from my point of view, each one of them is flawed. Nisargadatta's method is to tell stories, not all of which hold together logically from our point of view, but do from his point of view, with his identification as the absolute rather than identification as consciousness or as the body. So in order to understand Nisargadatta, you have to experience yourself and realize yourself as the absolute. And what does that mean? It means you reach a state where you're extremely quiet, extremely open and receptive, and the majesty and magnificence of consciousness is laid out in front of you, while you as consciousness, as the absolute, is separate from consciousness. That you can grasp the entirety of consciousness as an object. And you can hold the entirety of the manifest world of Brahman as being an object of your awareness. And then you have the capability of dropping this duality and just become yourself as the absolute. And when you do that, you also become the entirety of Brahman. It's a flip that takes place in you from watching, looking for the root of your consciousness. And when you find the root inside, deep down inside, there's a flip that takes place. And you as the absolute and Brahman, or the manifest world, become one. They're no longer dual. There's no longer a separate subject. You could say the manifest has eaten the absolute, or the absolute has eaten consciousness. There's no longer a distinction. This is a very subtle teaching, and I've laid it out as clearly as I could. And you should hear it over and over again, and read Nisargadatta over and over again. Read his talks, and then practice in either of falling in love with something in the external world, so the external world fills you with love, and the love is so strong you can recognize that you are love itself. That's step number one. But some of you will sidestep that step, and you'll become oneness, but without the joy that God realization brings. Both steps are necessary. Now, Nisargadatta doesn't talk about that step of God realization, not in his later states, but he does it in his first book, Self-Knowledge and Self-Realization, where he's totally a bhakti. And he talks about the energies, and he talks about the life divine, and also about the vital force, or God within, or I call it the life force. But in his later books, 1970 and beyond, he's totally beyond that. He's totally beyond the early part of his path of devotion, surrender, and God realization. He's making the transition from God realization to the root, to the absolute, to the stillness of nothingness. No object. All objects are witnessed, and he's the absolute witnessing consciousness. And this step too must be taken until he can allow the easy transition between the absolute, the totality of consciousness, and even focus down to the experiences of the body. Now, Nisargadatta and Robert both talk about the body as unreal. That's the first step. And I remember Robert saying that all the time. And I had no idea what he was talking about, that the body is illusory. That the body was an optical illusion, as is the world. But when you meet the divine within, and it explodes within you, you are transported to a different world, the world of the play of consciousness. And you're very happy in that play. Where Mary is right now, happy in the play of consciousness and the divine. And where she'll be for several years before she can step back beyond it. But Ian is beyond the state of that bliss and that God realization. And like me, It will come later to him. But you have to be ready to accept it at any time, to realize that God realization is an essential step to give you the courage and the energy to step beyond the play of consciousness as an identification. Do you understand that? Now, Cassie says you better hurry up because you're getting old, but it doesn't matter because you are already that absolute. You just have not apprehended it yet. So it doesn't matter if you die before you've apprehended it or not, because you already are the absolute. But apprehending the non-existence of the absolute beyond existence takes away that fear of fear of death altogether. And you realize you did not exist until you were born as consciousness or self-consciousness at the age of 2, 3, 4, or 5. And you won't be there after your body dies either. But you were able to perceive the manifest world from the birth of your body until you became a self as a human at age of 3, 4, or 5. But that entire 3 years is invisible to you. Your mind was not yet formed enough to be aware of the world of humanity and have memories of it, like you have memories of your youth now. And that's too why Nisargadatta keeps saying, what is the first memory you have of yourself and what was the circumstances? This is another way to pin you at that place between nothingness and beingness, non-beingness and beingness, the absolute and the manifest. So there are 2 methods, or more than that. There's the Robert method of being in the gap, which is in the gap of 2 thoughts, or more readily seen in the morning, where you awaken from the absolute into waking consciousness. That gap where there's just awareness of the world, but no thought and no forms yet. That's gap. I guess that's what Ranjit calls the selfless self. It's the self or the absolute without the incursion of body consciousness and identification with it. If I had to put it in a more abstract terms, the problem is identification. By progressive identification, you've narrowed yourself down to being a body in a certain circumstance in Bulgaria or Austria or the United States or Canada. And you've lived the life of a peon in a third-rate play that was always filled with sound and fury. But the play plays out for some, and they're more into silence. But without the God realization aspect, you don't have the explosion of energy necessary to sustain you in the world and to feel your mundane life with bliss, which allows you to have realization of the absolute with bliss, as opposed to the realization of the absolute without bliss, which is going from the mundane directly to the absolute, which was the way I did it under Robert. There was no bliss in my life then. And I just stayed in that gap for 15 years until the explosion of God within me came because of an external relationship. What I've told you may seem incredibly complex at this point, but it's a total message that I've derived or received first from Robert, then from Nisargadatta, and then a bit from Ramana, and then by my own realization, my own journey, my own relationship with God. Can anybody understand what I've said? Can anyone to understand what I've said? Can anybody say, oh, fuck, that sounds like a lot of work? But Robert said, the key to realization is just persistence. Another one might say the key is to surrender and love. But that's just a foretaste of a bigger picture of the divine life. Enter the divine life with God realization, with bliss. But you can have samadhi or becoming the absolute without bliss, or you can have it with bliss. And let me tell you, having it with bliss is a lot better. I was so touched that Krishna Das came to our satsang last Wednesday and stayed the entire time and chanted for us. Karima came and was able to go to Krishna Das's satsangs on Thursday night, but we weren't able to get in for some reason. I guess it was the iPad's fault. I can't say that it was my fault. I'll never admit to that. Now, Mark can say the iPad can enter that state and communicate and have a chat with Ram Das or whatever his name is, Krishna Das. They're all Das's and they're all Krishnas. But I'll doubt that and stick to my story. It's the computer's fault, not mine. And while I'm saying that, I really want to invite anybody who wants to come and visit me in Peoria, Arizona, to come. We have enough room, I'd say, for 3 or 4 people. 1 or 2 can get the bedroom, the second bedroom, which is modest, I would say. And if it's later in the year, another one can stay in the back enclosed patio that has a long couch that's very comfortable. And another one can stay on the front couch here in the living room by the window that is now occupied by 2 cat beds. But the cats can sleep on you instead of on those beds. And it'd be such a delicious experience for you and for them. Now, does anyone have any questions? I'm going to call this talk Deep Diving Nisargadatta number 1. And other talks I've given that Mark recorded, I will get them and post them as Deep Diving Nisargadatta number 2 and number 3, etc. There are only about 4, 5, 6 others that I want to post in this series, but it will be to completely explain Nisargadatta experientially, as well as Robert, and bring in references from all the other teachers that sort of point to the same direction. Now, does anyone have a question?
Ed, will they be posted on your blog or Facebook?
All of it.
Okay, because
YouTube, Facebook.
okay, so that's exquisite.
Hi, Edgy. You answered a question that was perplexing me to do with existence after death. You seem to have, you've nailed it this time, but you haven't been as explicit in my experience in describing the whole thing as you were today. I do have one fairly minor question. You said in the past that if you're on this path and it's good to have a romantic connection, a love connection to someone or something. Don't go on dating sites. Don't go looking for them. They will come to you when it's ready. And how do you explain the mechanism that happens through?
Anything I would say is just bullshit at this point, because that's above my pay grade. I don't know all of the plays of consciousness and of the absolute and how they work together or refuse to work together. But that's a different kind of science than I've got.
Maybe someone like Dia would have an explanation for something like that.
I don't know. I know Dia, and she wouldn't. She's
No?
not.
Okay.
She's not the vessel of that knowledge.
Okay.
Maybe you'll be the vessel of that knowledge.
One day, maybe. Thanks.
Are there anybody else that dare ask a question and to display their ignorance for everybody to see, which will make you feel like a little bug? Eddie, do you want to expose yourself and become a little bug and have everybody laugh at you at the density of your questions?
Yeah. So you were stating earlier that the absolute eats like the consciousness, like it flips. You were saying that earlier, like
Yes.
So it when you meditate on the bliss, will you naturally be guided to the absolute?
You got to realize that the ultimate meditator is the absolute.
Oh.
And that by looking for the absolute inside of yourself, eventually you flip and become the absolute. And your experience when you become the absolute is that the absolute disappears, and what is left is the totality of consciousness, the play of consciousness. And you and it are no longer separate. You are no longer observing it. You are it, the manifest, the totality of the manifest. You are Brahman. But after a while, being Brahman, you will flip back to being the absolute, watching it and finding your places that you feel most comfortable. And like Nisargadatta said, his whole life is a passage between those two states of flipping and being the absolute, or flipping and being the totality of love, the play of consciousness, the divine, so to speak, not the mundane, but the divine.
So it's possible to go back and forth between the two states. Oh,
Yes, it
okay.
is.
Cool.
Vesselina, wake up. Do you have a question?
No, maybe, yeah. I feel, Ed, I feel very uncomfortable when I think or feel that I'm losing control over my life.
Yes. So,
But that's it.
what do you want?
It's just, well, I don't know. I just feel so, like, I have nowhere to run away from it, and like everything's like crashing.
Vesselina, I got to tell you, I really enjoy watching you in satsang for the last few weeks, because you've gone deep enough to go into sleep or close to sleep, which is being in the absolute. It means that your awareness consciousness of the play of consciousness has diminished, and you're relaxing backwards into the absolute. Now, the other thing you have to realize from your perspective is all that you see and all that you feel and all that you hope for and all that you dread is unreal. That's the human level. That's the level of being educated by your family and society as to who and what you are. And you're feeling perplexed because you can't run from that state. You don't know how to get beyond that state. You only have to solve problems within that state. So the essential solution to your problems that you experience now is to realize they're not true at all. They're all illusion. And the only way you can get to a relief from that illusion is to dive into yourself and get to the source and make the transition to life divine, of becoming one with God and having God as your friend, as your big brother walking beside you, as your mother, and dwell in that bliss of the divine for a decade or so. But you know, that's not going to help you much at this time to hear this, because I'm saying you have to persevere. You have to dive deep. And you can't really believe in the illusion that's shaking you of having some control in your life, because you'll find you have no control whatsoever. God's in control.
It's very scary.
I know it's scary, but it's also exciting. If you look into that fear and find that fear, and your stomach is twirling and twisting because of that fear, you'll find an eddy of joy in that fear. And if you dive into that eddy of joy and identify that eddy of joy, that can become your awakening into the bliss of the play of consciousness, of oneness with God.
Thank you.
Maxie, what have you to say?
I don't know. What can I
You don't
say?
know. Your mind has stopped thinking. It's not focused on Bitcoin anymore. Or your Aikido career. Think instead of the death of your parents and stay there for a while.
Oh, I do think of that.
Good.
Everyone's
Because that's what I did with Kali. I dreaded her death. And it took me deep into myself. I still have a deep attachment to life, to the life force, to the inner vitality. And she was my love. She kept me feeling that love, just being with her. And the same with your parents. If you dwell in that grief, that pre-grief grief, you can find that same vibration that Vesselina can find by dwelling in her fear of the loss of control and enter into God consciousness totally. I love you, Max.
I love you too, Ed.
You love you?
I love you too, Ed.
Edgy, when you speak to us, are you speaking from the absolute? Sometimes you say that it's consciousness to consciousness and you don't know what the words are going to be, but it flows. And
I don't know where the hell it comes from. I think sometimes it comes from what I've learned based on my own experiences of passing into the absolute. But after spending 10 or 11 years in the play, the manifest,
right.
I think the messages come from wherever they do, and I don't know where it is. So I'll plead ignorance, or I'll say, it's my guru talking to you through me, which is what all those teachers do, the deep teachers. They say it's all my guru because they don't know. So that's what Muktananda told his swamis. When anybody asks you where these teachings come from, or how certain things manifested in the ashram, or certain spiritual experiences they had, they would just answer with Gute's finger, it's all my guru. My guru gave me everything. Guru gave me everything. Which is no explanation whatsoever. It's just a saying, get one with surrender. Realize what surrender to your guru is and who your guru is, until ultimately you realize that your guru is looking through your eyes as the absolute. And your eyes is you at a human level. And the bliss in between is the divine world. This is the most complete wrap-up I've given of my own understanding that's up till now. So there.
When you said that you spent 15 years in the absolute, as pure awareness, you're aware of consciousness. So you see the show, you see the movie and the Leela, but there's no Ed, or there's no Jay, or there's no, you don't have self-awareness in the absolute, as far as not to parse it too.
There was self-awareness, but the self-awareness also was observed.
Okay, I think I understand. I mean, you can't make the absolute, you can't make pure subjectivity an object. It's pure being, but in that state, well, as I just said, consciousness.
In that state, you become the totality of consciousness. You become Brahman.
Exactly.
But you lose contact with yourself as a body, even though you perceive the body, or yourself as a mundane person
Right.
caught in the web of the stories of your life up till that time. You now know that they're nonsense, that they're illusion, and you go through the motion of living your life, but without any pleasure in your life until there's God realization. You leave the mundane, but you haven't gotten to God realization, which would make the experience of doing nothing ecstatic.
That's
Going from the mundane to the absolute,
I love your satsang today.
like Ian is doing. And Ian, I hope you find it. I'll help you find that if you can, if I can, to find that God realization to make the rest of your trip entirely enjoyable, and where you won't care whether you find or become or know the absolute directly, because you'll be having such fun in the meantime. Instead of the way I did it, which is to go from being in the mundane world to make that transition into the absolute awareness of the being absolute, that there's a witness beyond the play of consciousness. But that play of consciousness contains all the joyful experiences you'll have, the bliss and God realization, because the play of consciousness is run by that inner vitality of the life force in conjunction with consciousness. And the mundane person can never see that. The mundane person only sees the daily life of a human being. And I say spirituality is not complete until you have both. The period of the awakening of Shakti as to the totality of the life force within you, the beingness within you, the joy within you, the love within you, and have the experiences of being that joy, have the experiences of being love, have the experiences of being God and one with God and surrendered to God all at the same time. And then dwelling in that, having the intensity of that experience package gradually degenerate or become less and less over a period of time. So now there's just you aware of the totality of the play and having still the smell of the joy of immersion in God. You got that? Smelling God, that'll be another lecture.
Every time I take a shower at the gym, I think of your shower awakening. All I do is get a little cleaner, not necessarily.
Well, what you do is when you get in that shower, close your eyes.
I do, yeah.
And feel the water hitting the skin on your back or on your chest.
It's absolutely so.
And then experience it and ask yourself, who feels that?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Who feels that?
Absolutely.
That will lead you to both. Well, that one will lead you to the absolute, the emptiness and the nothingness. But the God realization comes from a different route and path altogether, which is loving devotion and surrender, whether it's to a guru, to a rock, to a mountain, like Ramana did. And that will fill you with bliss and immense power, immense joy. And you'll go around shouting, I am, I am, I am. And if you're got it enough, you can run out in the streets, down the street naked, shouting, I am, I am, I am. Or like Robert, you can throw off your clothes in front of Ramana and bow to Ramana, even though other people say that's not possible, because Robert was never there. He made it all up. But when you hear him tell that story over and over again, there's no doubt that it happened to him. He may have embellished the story with how long he was there or what somebody said to him or who he stayed with and so forth, but those are all irrelevant. You know, by listening to him over and over again, he was there, whether he was there in his dreams or whether he was actually physically there. But he got to the point as the absolute when it wasn't relevant which one it was. He was talking to you from the absolute about consciousness and how you have to give up your mundane life, the stupid life that you've led up till the time you got immersed in God or in consciousness. This has been a long one. Has there been anybody else who wants to say something? Ask another story that will illuminate a different part of that oneness of the story I'm telling you and expand it a bit.
Hi, Edgy. You've spoken at length about how when you wake up to your human self and the world, that it's really another dream. So the dreams we have when we sleep are more ephemeral because they're mind stuff. It's like it's like surreal. But this dream appears to be stable and often appears quite real. What pointers, or would you be able to one day explain more in detail about the similarity between?
I guess I could, yeah.
Yeah, I would like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll keep that in mind because I have to think about it. Right now I can just say, I don't know. It's above my pay grade. I'll have to look at that because I'm dreaming once again now. I haven't for years.
Castaneda's books were incredible. I mean, I've read all of them. I used to wait till they came out. But he died of a heart attack at 57 in Berkeley, and he thought he as he was passing, he couldn't imagine that he wasn't enlightened and wasn't fulfilling one of the episodes of his stories. And he had devotees who ended up different parts, one of them in Sonora in the desert. They found her 20 years later, they found the remains. But the stories were magical. I mean,
I know.
I couldn't put them down. If I got one, I just had to read it to the end.
I knew Castaneda, not in a deep way, but as an acquaintance. We were both in the same department of anthropology at UCLA back then. And he was fighting to get one of his books recognized as his master's thesis or his PhD dissertation. And he was having a hard time because everybody thought he was full of shit, but he was so famous and so wealthy at that point, they let him go anyway and gave him a PhD. And can you imagine such a asshole bunch of people like the PhDs in an anthropology organization or study, making from them their point of view, what would you say it, a bowing down to the ridiculous in order to get more fame or to get some money. And that's the way that caste system is. Castaneda was entirely outside of their caste system, but they let him in because he was a special guest, so to speak.
They never, I mean, the only way they came down on it was either he was an extraordinary storyteller, which he was, or everything that he said happened. Of course, he was always in Oaxaca doing mushrooms, So he was stoned out of his mind most of the time. But, and also Don Juan Matus, I believe is like Al, it's like Al Smith, was such a common surname, but that didn't matter because the stories, as I said, the power of, I mean, just, I'm surprised, well, that someone hasn't made movies out of them, but in a way, who cares? The stories are magical. It doesn't have to go any further. I can still pick up any one of them and be transported. Just, I mean, I've been in
I
Oaxaca.
have to leave now
Okay.
for the usual reason. And you can all come back on Wednesdays. And I'll greet you with love.
Thank you, Edgy.
Take care.
I love you so
Bye-bye.
much.
If I can figure out how to get out.